Okay, hello everyone. Today I'm going to do a quick little video on think, pair, share. Now, think, pair, share. Normally I don't do videos on activities, I guess, but because this one is used so commonly, I actually think that it's almost more of a teaching strategy per se than just a specific type of activity. So I guess that's from a technical perspective, but whenever we do anything in schools or when we're teaching students and we do it to such an extent that it becomes an integral part of our day-to-day or weekly teaching approach or repertoire or whatever you want to say, I think it's worth then talking about that particular activity or that thing that we do in order to think about what best practice is. Now, think, pair, share is just an old school, very traditional teaching strategy that's been around for as long as I can remember and way before my time. So there's nothing new about it. As with a lot of strategies these days, teachers and curriculum developers and people who make resources and things try and come up with lots of different variations. And there's not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but the bare bones core approach of think, pair, share still applies. And that's something you'll notice with a lot of these teaching and behaviour management strategies, and particularly if you ever go and read research from way back when they first started talking about this, or when research first really started happening in an academic sense. They've been talking about this type of stuff for 70 odd years. So there's nothing really new about it. There's always fancy terms that people like to use, but again, these are old school traditional strategies that are here now. And if you're just starting your career, they're still going to be here in 20 or 30 years' time. So think, pair, share is a very simple strategy with lots of different variations, and I encourage you to experiment and do it in lots of different ways. I want to get through this webinar relatively quickly because I think it's a very simple strategy and I don't want to make something simple overly complex, but in a standard lesson, this is sort of a explicit instruction type lesson, which is what 99% of teachers around the world use. You're going to have, again, some type of intro, some type of conclusion, review, whatever, and you're going to have some type of teacher-centered activity, usually at the start, which, well, that's a teacher-centered activity, that's a teacher-centered activity. This is kind of a bit of both, so it's a mixture between that teacher-centered and student-centered activity. So normally that will be, say, modelling or worked examples or instructions of some description. Quite often there'll be some individual work, so the teacher might structure out some answer this question, answer that question, practice and so forth. So there might be some individual practice there at some stage. And quite often, I mean, a simple way to do it, and you can mix this up, is go individual, then pair, then group, then whole of class, and then back to individual teacher / opportunities to respond, although that kind of happens in the whole of class activity anyway. So that's one method of doing a pretty standard lesson. You don't have to follow that, but it just gives you an idea of different ways that you can divide it up. Obviously, you can divide it up into learning styles if you want, or whatever. There's millions of different ways. But typically, these are highly structured lessons that use a lot of pace and a lot of the teachers try and get momentum happening and moving through in short, sharp activities. Now, with think, pair, share, you could do it as part of that group activity or just as one activity that kind of goes there, or quite often it'll come straight after the intro, so it'll go there. But what actually happens is it'll be divided up into, say, little sections. So these are little 2-minute sort of sections. Maybe you could plan for 2 minutes. It always takes longer than you think it will, and over time it'll, as you get better at it, it'll actually take longer and longer in most instances. When you first start doing any of these strategies, you'll find that you go through activities really quickly, but over time you learn to really suck that information out of students and to spend more time asking questions and checking for understanding and things like that. So the think basically means that the teacher is asking students to individually think about something. So they pose a question. Sometimes they'll get a response or whatever. But quite often the teacher will say, okay, think about this. Here's a question. Write it down on a piece of paper. So that doesn't necessarily mean just literally thinking in their head. Usually that means on paper most of the time. And then from there, usually what we're doing is getting students with their partner, so the person next door to them. So that's kind of a share as well, but usually so they write down an answer on paper and then they'll have a chat with their friend So chat with their friend, and that can involve a whole range of different things, whether it's swapping answers with their friend, explaining their answer to their friend, thinking about or having a chat about whether you both agree, that kind of thing, and then sharing it. So quite often this is where it goes back to a whole of class type thing where the teacher is then asking for responses. Now, this bit here, these are highly structured activities. You don't have to do it that way. Again, there's lots of different variations, but I like to do everything in a really highly structured way. And I think as teachers become, the further they move away from their initial training, and the same happens with teacher aides and how they deliver things as well, the more experienced you get, and the more you forget about all the mumbo jumbo you learnt when you're at uni, the more you start to structure things over time. That's just my personal opinion. I'm sure that there are teachers who do it the other way, but generally when you first start teaching, you're doing a lot more, and this is how teachers get taught these days, student-centred activities and things like that. And then over time, they become more and more conservative and traditional in their teaching approaches. So anyway, again, that's just my personal opinion. There's certainly no research around that, but that's just what I see in the thousands of schools that we visit. So you're doing something here for, let's use a different pen, 20 seconds. So the teacher will talk for 20 seconds, and then they might give the student 30 let's go 30 and 30. So I'm being a bit silly here, but around about a minute. So you're giving the student, that part takes around about a minute. The little chat, you give them 60 seconds. And I like to time things. So I like to say, literally, you got 60 seconds, go. And when 60 seconds is up, that's it. Dead silence, eyes back on me. So that's another 60 seconds to confer with their friend to make sure they got their answer right, or to share with their friend or whatever, and then share. So that's the chat. You will have the opportunity to respond is the technical term. And again, that can take anywhere from 60 seconds, but it can also take up to 4 to 5 minutes. So you'll be surprised at how quickly 4 to 5 minutes passes when you're actually going through and asking this student, bouncing to this student then gives you another response. You might do an example on the board. You might get a student to come up and do an example on the board, so on and so forth. So anything can happen in that sort of realm, which is why when you're doing this planning stuff, whether you're a teacher aide or teacher or coach or whoever you are and however you're doing a lesson, going through when you're doing this, you allocate about 5 minutes or so for each of those. You might have 10 questions that you're going to go through. Depending on the topic, you quite often just make those questions up as you go, depending on how students are doing, where they had problems with here when you got that feedback. So you're getting that feedback, doing that formative assessment, getting that feedback, and then directing the next question based on that information you've got there. So you're starting that process again. So that's it's like a lockstep process. It takes, let's say, a minute here, and then a minute, and then a minute, and then start again, and a minute, and start again. Very lockstep, and you'll be surprised at how quickly 5 or 6 questions will take 20 or 30 minutes to get through, sometimes, depending on the actual question. So you can use this for any activity, writing, spelling, sport, science, maths, sewing, cooking. You can, and the other thing is too, you don't necessarily have to do it as sort of that little quick, short, sharp activity type way of doing things. You can do it over a longer period of time. So you can do, this can be 10 minutes or so where they're doing some individual practice of some description. This can be more of small group work. It doesn't even have to be a pair, but generally that's the old school way of doing it. And this kind of class discussion-y thing at the end might take a little bit longer. So that could actually be another way of structuring out some type of activity or a lesson plan. So have a shot at using Think, Pair, Share. It's very, very effective. There's another sort of strategy called I call it set and forget. Not set and forget. I always say that. I don't know why. Set and circulate. And set and circulate is what new teachers or new teacher aides or whatever will do, new coaches or trainers, and that's where they set an activity up here and then they wander around. So they'll set an activity up here, they might do some type of model, and then they'll set a 20-minute activity and they may do some more class stuff here and then set another activity. So they're sort of avoiding doing that explicit instruction stuff because of lack of confidence or whatever, or just because a lot of people just don't get taught this basic 101, teaching 101 type stuff, teaching strategies 101, I guess you can call it, instructional design. And I call that the set and circulate model. So that's just what I personally have termed it, I guess. And that set and circulate model or strategy, I guess, it can be used. You can use it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it's not the preferred method 95% of the time. 95% of the time, you're going to want to be using some type of think, pair, share, even if you're getting rid of the pair bit. So that's more common in a pure explicit instruction or direct instruction type model where you're asking questions, you're getting feedback, asking questions, getting feedback, asking questions, getting feedback. So have a think about that one. That's called think, pair, share, or you could always just call it think, share. More of an activity than a strategy per se, but because we use it so much and because it's used around the world for all age groups and in all topics, and it's an integral part of how we design out your standard maths lesson, your standard English lesson and so forth. Even if you then make quite a lot of adjustments on it, I like to use that as a basis or a foundational type activity or type of activity strategy, if you will, to get us thinking about best practice when it comes to designing out and structuring lesson plans and activity plans. So that is think, pair, share.